In 1976, the arcade video game production company Exidy released its highly controversial arcade feature titled Death Race. Although this game would be considered no worse than Pac-Man by today's standards, its release triggered a 39-year state of moral panic regarding the dangerous impact that user-controlled violence could have on society. The debate surrounding this panic spurs the same question over and over again. Do violent video games encourage violence amongst its users? Since 1976, gaming has progressed at a phenomenal rate. Games now have near lifelike graphics and allow users to connect in cyberspace. The combination of this never-seen-before graphic realism and the violent nature of these games continues to perpetuate an inevitable moral panic throughout society. Wayne LaPierre, the NRA executive director, has gone so far as to argue that video games are a corrupting and violent form of pornography. But is this panic at all warranted? Following the release of Grand Theft Auto V in 2013, perhaps one of the most controversial games ever released, a massacre occurred in Washington, D.C. The gunman, named Aaron Alexis, killed 12 people in a Washington naval base, using a gun which was similar to one of the main available weapons in Grand Theft Auto V. As well as this, he was an avid consumer of video games such as Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto. The media exploited this tragedy as a means to perpetuate the already existing moral panic surrounding video games, presenting Alex's consumption of video games as the main cause for the murders. This is an example of both a decontextualized representation of media and the dangers of effect theory. It later came to light that Alexis suffered from mental illnesses, which began when he witnessed in person the horrific events of 9/11. This massacre was not the first to draw a correlation with violent video games. Among others, the Columbine High School massacre also stirred debates over the effect that violent video games have on youth culture. However, in both instances, the gunmen involved were found to suffer from serious and dangerous mental health issues. In examining these cases, we can understand the temptation to find causation between violent video games and the violent actions of these murderers. Not only does the correlation seem logical, the blame for their actions can be alleviated from surrounding influences, which perhaps are more difficult to discuss, and instead place them on their partaking in violent games. In doing so, media and anti-video game advocates are able to continue heightening the moral panic surrounding violent video games in society. Many studies have been undertaken trying to prove or disprove this belief. However, the research is naturally flawed. Often these studies take place under strictly academic and scientific conditions. One study, as reported in the New York Times, had volunteer subjects play a violent video game for 15 minutes and then feed chili sauce to fellow classmates. The study found that subjects who had played the violent video games directly prior were more likely to dole a larger portion of hot sauce to their classmate, thus arguing that the violent video game results in an inclination towards cruelty. This study, though, is incredibly flawed. Firstly, the study is designed with the intention of proving that video games cause violence. This creates a biased atmosphere under which the experiments take place. Already, the validity of the findings must be questioned. Secondly, studies of this nature fail to address potential external influences within the observed environment, such as the psychological conditions of the subjects being tested and their understanding that their actions will have no moral or legal consequence whatsoever. When trying to determine whether violent video games create violence in society, a small and controlled environment with specifically chosen test subjects under particular circumstances will prove nothing more than a flawed approach to research. In fact, the only studies which hold any real persuasive standing regarding this issue are those of a sociological nature. There have been a large number of studies which monitor and compare the release and consumption of video games over a period of several months or years and plot these figures against rates of crime in the same areas. Now, of course, studies of this nature are also flawed, as they fail to account for, once again, external factors that may influence the figures in either direction. They are, however, the only studies which come even close to measuring the actual change in societal behavior against the presence of violent video games in society. And each of these studies produce the same figures: that there is no correlation between an increase of violent video games and the presence of violence in society. In fact, one study by Engelstad, Cunningham, and Ward found that a 1% increase in violent video games correlates with a 0.03% decrease in violence in society. The truth is that we as humans have been violent long before video games came along. Genocides, rape, murder, pedophilia, psychopaths, each one of these things can be found not only over and over again in history, but even in the majority of religious texts. It would seem that this global moral panic over violent video games is yet another example of effect theory. It seems that it is easier to say that violent video games are responsible for violence in society than it is to consider that perhaps society is violent and thus have created violent video games. This decontextualized view to video games reduce a complex and multi-layered psychological response to an unsupported belief in a result and create a common enemy, which is easier to rally against than the more intricate and complex nature of